Thanks so much. Good morning. Thanks for coming. I'll talk just very briefly to introduce the program of films we'll be looking at today. You'll see that the first one begins in 1895. And the history of cinema has lots of beginnings, but one of them is a beginning that begins with an end, and that's the end of work. So here I'm referring not to the Louis Lumière film that we'll look at in a moment, but to another Lumière film, Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory. And it's a single 45-second take of exactly what the title says it is. The workers stream out of the factory gates at the end of their shift. And Jean-Louis Comolli writes about this film. He mentions it at the beginning of an essay about the relationship between film and labor. And I'll just read a quote from him. He writes, documentary or not, the cinema has not often filmed work for a whole host of reasons. The same reasons, without a doubt, that led it to film love and seduction so often. The first film tells us about the first of these reasons. It's in leaving the Lumière factory that the workers give themselves over to the cinema, that they attain the status of both actresses and soon-to-be spectators. Taking leave of work, they enter into a world of enchantment and distraction, because the world of work is only weakly enchanted or enchanting, and unlikely to be in return enchanted by the cinema, except in the form of a nightmare, end quote. So the idea here is that cinema tends not to represent work because it would involve too harsh a confrontation with things like exploitation, struggle, boredom, exhaustion. Instead, it has focused on leisure, on romance, on spectacle. And Comolli says, and rightly so, I think that cinema has not often depicted the world of work, but in fact, sometimes it has. And today we will be looking at instances in which it has, specifically in relation to the ocean. And the ocean, I think, gives lots of opportunities to depict the world of enchantment and distraction that Comolli says cinema loves to engage with. And we see this in many fiction films, where the sea is really a site of wonder, of adventure, of conquest. And these are representations that I would say that are often highly mythic, highly romanticized, and which tend to reaffirm a fantasy of human mastery over the flux of oceanic space. By contrast, the films that we will be looking at today are 5 very different nonfiction films made in 5 different countries over a span of more than 100 years. And they look at the ocean as a site of labor, very broadly conceived. And I think they either critically interrogate these romantic myths and this aspiration to mastery, or they refuse them entirely. Some of them depict labor or thematize labor more overtly than others, but this is a thread that runs throughout all of them in various ways, and it's one that I would say will be represented with growing directness as the day goes on. I felt that this was an important thing to address in a film program, not only as a way of countering this tendency that Comolli describes for the cinema to avoid depictions of work, but because it also counters the tendency to think of the ocean as a void, an empty space, or a purely natural realm. And it can be all of those things, I'm not denying that, but it's also a space of work, and it's also a space of human sustenance. And more specifically, it tends to be a site of manual labor. It's a site of many forms of work and material circulation that often get forgotten about when we talk about our time as one characterized by the rapid movement of information or by forms of affective or immaterial labor. And so we'll see in the films that we'll watch this morning, Rebecca Myers' Blue Mantle and Francisco Rodriguez's A Moon Made of Iron, we'll see that these are films that actually are visually structured around an interplay between the emptiness of oceanic space and an understanding of the ocean as an inhabited place of human struggle. So emptiness emerges as a kind of important aesthetic principle in both films. I would say it invokes emptiness in order to sort of contest it. Many of the representations of work we'll see today do possess some of the nightmarish qualities that Comolli mentions. In A Moon Made of Iron, Francisco Rodriguez connects the suicide of a worker at a Foxconn factory in Shenzhen, China, to Chinese workers who attempt to flee their fishing boat off the coast of Chile in Patagonia. In Hiranabi's, all that, Hira is here, and we'll be talking later. In Hiranabi's, All That Perishes at the Edge of Land, we meet migrant workers at a shipbreaking yard in Pakistan who speak of their perilous working conditions and the health risks that they take in working at that site. And then in our final film of the day, Tsuchimoto Noriyaki's The Shiranui Sea, we'll see how traditional forms of work that are deeply valued, such as fishing, have been threatened or even made impossible by environmental contamination emanating from another kind of work, emanating from a chemical factory. Yet I would say that despite the sort of gravity and sometimes heartbreaking nature of some of what we'll encounter in these films, I think there's a concern across all of them to search for ways to represent the toil and the damage experienced by workers while avoiding any kind of spectacularization of suffering. We'll see that a few of the films take up very oblique approaches to their subject matter. And each film, I would say, tries to invent its own way of finding an ethical approach to its subject matter. And this could range from lyrical abstraction in the films by Rebecca Myers and Francisco Rodriguez to fictional speculation and reflexive ethnography in the case of Hiranabi's film, to long-term durational commitment in the case of Tsuchimoto, who made some 17 films over a period of decades in and around Minamata Bay, and we'll be watching what is perhaps the most celebrated of these. And just to begin to conclude and to introduce the first film that we'll be looking at today, another reason that I thought I would begin with this Comolli quotation is that it brings us back to 1895. And rather than the kind of terrestrial ground of workers leaving a factory, we'll be looking at a second lesser-known Lumiere film, also a 45-second single take, Boat Leaving the Harbor. And as you'll see, it's a very simple film. You'll see two women and two children watching three men as they push out from the shore in a rowboat. We don't know why the men are going to sea, but maybe they're going to work, maybe. So the women and children watch the men, and we watch all of them. And just before the film ends, and this is not a spoiler, but okay, the boat is confronted with the force of the waves, and it kind of rocks to the side a little bit, and then the film ends. So this is an event of pure chance. It's something the filmmaker could have never planned. 45 seconds was as long as a film could be in 1895. So the film is this eruption of contingency, and we never know what happens to these rowers. So it's super, super simple, but I think it raises a lot of very relevant questions. It returns us to a cinema before the development of fictional narrative, when there was an interest in capturing the fleeting movements of the world. The sort of legend goes that this was a time when spectators were most interested in looking at the small kind of ancillary details of the film image more than the ostensible focus of the action. So the rustle of the wind in the trees in the background was the source of great fascination. And unlike any medium before it, film promised to capture these traces of the world in time. It could register moments and events that were outside of any human control or outside of any kind of artistic intentionality. And for the writer Di Vaughan, A Boat Leaving the Harbor is a film that is especially significant in this regard, because the kind of emphasis on contingency and chance is something that engulfs the human and literally threatens to throw him overboard into the ocean. And so Di Vaughan writes, "Man, no longer the mountebank self-presenter, has become equal with the leaves and the brick dust." And these were some of the things that fascinated those early spectators, leaves and dust. So man becomes equal with leaves and dust and as miraculous. So there's a sense that in A Boat Leaving the Harbor, cinema and the ocean emerge somehow as kin. They're united by this inhuman animus, by this interest in flux, by this sense that they can dislodge the human from the pedestal that he has sought to occupy for so long. So the film, in a way, it seems super simple, but there's something I think very fascinating in it about the way it undoes the fantasy of a well-ordered, controllable world. So as we know, soon after the invention of cinema, fictional narrative came to dominate film production around the world. But I think it's worth remembering that other paths through film history exist. So alongside, and in some cases against, all of the engagements with entertainment and fictional narrative that tend to avoid representations of work, cinema has also mounted a challenge to aesthetic forms predicated on anthropocentrism, on coded messages, and on predetermined meanings. And so they really present a different vision of cinema than the one that most often prevails. And it's one, I think, that foregrounds the medium's ability to record the contingencies of reality in ways that exceed control and planning. And so this, I think, is a very rich counter-tradition that runs throughout the 20th century and into our time, and it's represented especially in documentary film and in artist film. And it's one that I think unites the 5 very, very different films that we'll be looking at today. So we'll start first with the first 3 films together, and then we'll have maybe just like a 5-minute kind of break. We'll come back to watch Hiranabi's All That Perishes at the End of Land, and then she and I, Edge of Land, rather, and then she and I will be in conversation, and we'll begin the lunch break actually at 1:15. It'll be 45 minutes instead of 1 hour. And then in the afternoon, we'll come back for the Sharonoi Sea introduced by Ricardo Matos Cabo. So thanks for your attention and enjoy the screenings.